New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring psychic surgery in the Philippines, and my guest is Debra Lynne Katz, who is a regular guest host here on New Thinking Aloud. Debra is also the president of the International Remote Viewing Association. She is author of several books, including You Are Psychic, The Art of Clairvoyant Reading and Healing, Extraordinary Psychic, Proven Techniques to Master Your Natural Psychic Abilities, Freeing the Genie Within, Manifesting Abundance, Creativity, and Success in Your Life, and co-authored with John Knowles, Associative Remote Viewing, The Art and Science of Predicting Outcomes for Sports, Politics, Finance, and the Lottery. Debra lives in Oregon, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Debra. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Oh, thank you. So happy to be here with you as well.
I was very surprised to receive, I don't know why it came over a year late, in my mailbox, the July 2023 issue of the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research with your big article featured in it. And to learn, I've known you now rather well. We've done many interviews together, and I didn't know about your field work in the Philippines.
Yes, well, that issue did just recently come out. I think it just took them a while to release it. And yes, I have really kind of separated out my field work, as you call it. Really, I think of that as my way past. And when I really got into remote viewing and remote viewing research, maybe about 12, 13 years ago or so, I just felt like there was a need to keep all of that separate, maybe to just be more scientific, or there's a lot of people in the remote viewing field who just really are uncomfortable with some of these other more esoteric areas. So it's not that I hid it, but I just moved my attention on other things.
The truth is that you spent a number of months in the Philippines engaged in, I'm calling it field work, but I suppose, what was your attitude at the time when you went? Did you go as a student or as a researcher or as a seeker?
Well, definitely as a seeker and a student, but I wasn't there as part of any formal program. I had initially heard about the healing going on there from some of my teachers that were part of the Berkeley Psychic Institute, and this is already going back to the mid-90s. And I had gone with a couple of my teachers for about a week and a half or so, where we visited with a number of healers. And after that experience, I came back and just everything was different for me. It was so different. In fact, at that time, I was serving as a federal probation officer. And after a few months of coming back, I just felt like I couldn't do that job anymore. And I basically had some very powerful dreams and other experiences, and just decided I needed to leave that line of work and devote myself to my spiritual work. But I didn't really have any idea what that meant. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I just knew I needed to go in a different direction. And that's when I decided, because I could trace the very powerful changes I was going through to at least partially what was had happened when I went to the Philippines. So I decided I was going to sell all my things and I was going to take that little bit of money and go to the Philippines. And I was determined to stay there until I learned how to do what the healers were doing. So that's why I went. I wanted to become a healer and a psychic surgeon myself. And that's what started the journey there.
It's a noble ambition. And I am reminded now that you bring up the Berkeley Psychic Institute and your background there. Of course, in my early years as a student at Berkeley, I knew the people at the Berkeley Psychic Institute well. There was also a fellow, goes back now to the 1970s, as I recall, his name was Doug Vogt, and he was a Westerner who went to the Philippines and learned psychic healing there, came back, and he had a group of people in the Bay Area, and I interviewed them. I had a radio show at KPFA at the time, as I recall, and these people were practicing psychic surgery, but they felt it wasn't enough, and they learned about the Berkeley Institute, this Berkeley Psychic Institute, and they came to me and said, these are the people who they know about chakras and energy and grounding. And so all of these people who were studying psychic surgery originally became students of the Berkeley Psychic Institute. Louis Bostwick.
Exactly. And yeah, that doesn't surprise me, because one of the many things I learned when I went to the Philippines is that the healers really couldn't articulate what they were doing or give you step-by-step instructions in the way that I learned from both at BPI and some offshoots. Like I also went to Asclepion Healing Center and learned different modes of healing where you couldn't really say how it ultimately worked, but you could say, here's the steps, here you do these steps, and then you both can feel the effects. Whoever you're working can feel them. So you get some verification by what both of you are experiencing, and, you can teach it to others. And that's what I did. My first book, You Are Psychic, The Art of Clairvoyant Reading and Healing, really took a lot of those methods that weren't written down before you could only learn them by attending school there, and it put them into writing. So, I was very much about methodology and looking for that when I went to the Philippines. And so what I did when I actually moved there was I would find a healer who was willing to let me observe them and meet with them. And pretty much I would go day after day to observe what a healer was doing to try to figure out how they did what they did. And also, hoping they would give me instruction. In the end, yes, I got a little bit of insights into their methods, but most of them really couldn't articulate what they were doing.
Well, I think it would be useful to state right up front, because I know you're not the only person. Doug Vogt, who I mentioned earlier, Alberto Violdo, an anthropologist, has also had this experience of working. I think in Alberto's case, it was Mexican healer. But you have moments when you actually, under the guidance of these healers, many of whom have been accused of fraud, of course, but you find that you've putting your hand inside of the body of one of the patients. And you yourself had such an experience, as I recall.
Yes, I did. And, we can definitely get into the topic of, is this real? Is this not? How can you tell how much of it was real? There's a lot of questions there, but yes, in some ways, you may not be able to ever know for sure if something is real or not. In that context, I would say except that I did have more than a couple experiences, but one in particular that stood out, that when I go into doubt, which of course there's a lot of it because and for people who don't know what psychic surgery is, it's basically where the healer is putting their hands on someone, and the idea is that their hands, at least like energetically, are entering into the body, but then you can see supposedly manifestations coming out of the body, and these will look like blood clots, a lot of blood, a lot of red liquid, sometimes there's yellow liquid, like pussy stuff. I've seen all different colors come out. It's rather gross. Sometimes objects will come out. And the idea is that the energy is getting manifested, so it's not like if you measured them, it's not that you're, taking out a certain amount of blood, like as if you were, using a needle and pulling it out. But you're actually manifesting the disease in a physical form that you could then see and feel, and it has to be disposed of. Sometimes it just disappears. Sometimes it, just has to be flushed out or put in the garbage. So you're manifesting energy into physical matter is the theory. And, that sounds so bizarre and fantastical. But there's various reasons why very intelligent people would actually believe that this was happening. And so the one example that I could give that I hold on to is where I was observing a healer named Brother William. And he was known as the kangaroo healer because he would heal so many people. And these were mostly poor Filipino people. And they would come to his clinic. You had to drive to this mountainous area and then go down this mountain. And a lot of people were just walking down it barefoot. They didn't even have shoes. And they would sit there in these little chairs anywhere they could find. And he had 2 healing beds. And he would jump from bed to bed because there were so many people to heal. That's why they called him the kangaroo healer. And I would stand very close by observing, sometimes meditating, but a lot of times observing with my eyes open. And on one occasion, he gestured for me to come over, and then he pointed to the wall and gestured for me to take these tweezers off of the wall. They were these big tweezers. And I thought that was a little strange. So I went and got them. And then he said the word tumor. And there was a woman lying on the bed. She had just gotten onto it. And he put his hands on her chest. And then he opened up the chest. I saw the chest open. And you could see inside, and you could see the tissue. He was like pushing on her chest, and something that looked like a tumor. Now, I'm not a medical doctor. I've not ever been involved in surgery, but you could see something inside the chest, and he was gesturing that I should take the tweezer and pull it out. Now, I was absolutely horrified and profusely protesting against this, saying, no, I can't do this. I was really worried I was going to pull out the wrong thing, but he was like, no, come on. So I took the tweezer and I pulled it out. It reached in, it was connected to other tissue, and it had to be separated. And I pulled it out, and then he just simply took his hands away, and the body closed up before my eyes. And then we took the tumor, whatever the thing was, and dropped it into a little bowl, and someone carried it, his assistant carried it away. So, when I think about my whole experience there, I go back to that one incident. There were multiple witnesses. Other people talked about it. The woman got off the table. She thanked him. She thanked me. It was just a little bit red on her chest. Otherwise, she was fine and walked away. And I know that happened.
He didn't use, I gather, a knife or a blade of any kind to open up her chest. I presume he just pulled it apart with his hands.
he just laid his hands on there, and then it was just suddenly open. Yeah. It makes no logical sense. It's impossible to have happen by every definition and theory we have. It's just impossible, but it happened. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, that wasn't the only example of something that remains in your mind even after all of these years. And if I understand correctly, we're talking about an event that took place, 20 years ago or so?
Yeah, that would have been really about 27 years ago or so. Yes. I observed I observed hundreds and hundreds of different, they call it the bloody operation. And I received many myself. And beyond just watching it, which, I will say when I first came there, I was much more open-minded, because my teachers seemed to believe that many of these healers were legitimate. And so I went there with that belief. Now, when I first went with a group, and I actually, even when I moved there, I started off with a group coming with me for about 2 weeks, and then they left and I stayed. And so with multiple people and multiple experiences, we were already energy healers. And so a lot of us have a sense of when energy's moving, when, you walk into a room and there's a change in the room. And so there were certain healers where the moment you walk into the room, you can feel something's different, whereas some healers, you don't feel anything. And then again, some of us had these very powerful experiences, when we were at particular healers, like in their chapels or on their premises. So beyond just, seeing things with your eyes, you have these different personal experiences that also contribute to, having some belief that something is actually happening here. But what I found when I lived there was basically what happened was there was one healer, Brother Lawrence. I think he's since passed. He was willing to meet with me and supposedly give me some instruction. We would meet in his office and he would give me some very good advice. It really wasn't instruction in how to do healing, but it was more about just living. And he gave me some lessons that I've held to this day. However, as I was sitting there observing him, he had someone named Manuel come in to help him do hot needling and some acupuncture. And Manuel and I got to know each other. And as it turned out, we started dating. Anyway, going back to that time, I found it interesting that he needed Manuel, who was a self-taught acupuncturist, one of the few acupuncturists in all of the Philippines. I found it interesting that Brother Lawrence needed Manuel to come and do acupuncture if he was already a psychic surgeon. So that was a little unusual. And I found that Manuel did not believe in psychic surgery at all. And we would have these big arguments because at the time I was like, how can you say this? Just go look yourself. And what I found out was later on, Manuel had a brother who was a healer, and he didn't tell me that his brother did psychic surgery. He just said that he was a really strong healer who was very popular. Well, Manuel's brother got invited to Poland, and after I had been in the Philippines for about 11 months. I was getting tired of being in the Philippines. It was really, we lived in places with no running water, and life is just challenging there. So Manuel's brother invited us to go to Poland, where Manuel would do acupuncture. I would do some clairvoyant readings and diagnosis, and he would do healing. And he brought with him the son of a famous healer. So Manuel's brother and this other healer, they already had these organizers who were very, very excited about them coming back. They had been there several times. Well, while we were on our way there, we found out that these organizers expected them to do the psychic surgery, the bloody operation. And I was like, well, how are they going to do that? They're not psychic surgeons. And Manuel was like, well, he didn't want to say anything more, but he was like, yes, they do psychic surgery when they're there. But what happened was their suitcases got delayed. And so their suitcases were like a day behind us. When we landed, they didn't have them. And our organizers met us at the airport, and they said to the two healers, sorry, we don't have time to go back to your rooms. We have a whole bunch of people, very important people who are funding this whole trip, and they want you to do psychic surgery on their families. But these guys panicked, and I was like, what's the problem? I know they're a little tired, but why, what's the big deal? And that's when it all came out, not to the organizers, but I was part of a private conversation where they were panicked because they didn't have their supplies, which was the fake materials and everything that they needed in order to go and fake this bloody operation. And as it was explained to me later by Manuel, not them, because this was like a taboo subject to talk to with them, but that yes, they do energy healing, and he himself, really has seen results from their work, people really getting healed, but they feel that, one, they won't be as popular if they're not doing the operation, and two, they feel as if the people that they're healing won't believe in it if they can't see something physical. So it's both an economic boost for them, and then also they feel that they're more effective if people can believe. Now, personally, I am just like you would be, completely opposed to any kind of trickery, faking anything. I don't care if it does have a positive benefit on someone. I just think it's, absolutely just incomprehensible to behave in that way. And as it turned out, I was very upset when I learned about this. I was so upset, and I didn't know what to do because we were supposed to go on like a month-long tour all through Poland, working with these guys. So I went to bed that night just praying for some guidance, and just so upset, praying for some guidance. And when I woke up, I discovered that I was bleeding. So I was rushed to the hospital. As it turned out, I had to make the very difficult decision, do I want to be on this grand adventure healing? But then the flip side is I'm with these people doing things I don't agree with, or, just go home and have to, start a life there on my own. And that's what I did. That is the story of how I discovered the psychic surgeons were not all being honest. And, it's hard to say how many are or how many aren't. What I will say, though, even before I realized all that, when I met Manuel, I was very impressed with him because he was an acupuncturist. He wasn't doing anything, that extraordinary. But what was extraordinary, so in the Philippines, if you don't have the money to pay for your treatment, even like the IV bag, and if you don't have that money, they will just turn you away. So we would see people in the parking lot who had been turned away, who were having heart attacks and were essentially dying. There were times we went, like, sat in a car with people, and he was doing acupuncture and I was doing energy healing, because the families wanted something before the person just died because they were denied entry into the hospital. And so Manuel treated so many people, he didn't charge them. He had a patient right before we met where he basically like moved in with the guy for months and nursed him back to health. And, every ounce of his being was dedicated towards getting someone back to health. And I realized that even though I came to the Philippines with the idea that, I wanted to learn these, really dramatic forms of healing. And I think it was, so I could really, demonstrate to people that this was real. I think that's what that was about. Like, it wasn't enough to just put your hands on someone and have, them feel the energy or get better, because there's so many people not even believing that that was real. So I think I really felt like, well, if I could learn to do this and you could, see these manifestations, people will believe me. But what I realized was that's not what healing is about. Healing is about the care that one person has for another and, the effect that they get from that. So I really, for the most part, gave up, being with the dramatic healers. And then Manuel and I just traveled all over the Philippines to, areas where people had no medical care. And when they weren't able to like handle the needles because they were too sensitive or afraid or whatever, that's where I would step in and just do, more of the energy healing that I came to learn how to do. I did have another experience that you might want to hear about from a healer that was called the Exorcist.
Yes, please.
That healer wasn't doing psychic surgery. He would occasionally do what's called hot cupping, and you've probably seen examples of this where a glass is put onto the body and then it sucks out. It's supposed to suck out impurities and it leaves like a big red circle on the body. So he would sometimes do that. But his name was David Olagani, and he had this beautiful chapel with a beautiful, colorful picture on the back wall. And it was a little chapel where there were dogs and chickens walking around. And we went there first with my teachers and some other students. And he and his wife would lay a person on a table, and he would be at their feet and his wife would be at their head. And the whole time his wife would just be laughing and laughing, and you didn't really know why she was laughing, and she wouldn't be speaking in English, but he would be speaking in English, and he would start to yell, "Get out, you demon, get out." And so they were doing exorcisms. And as I sat in the audience, I would watch how many times people after a little bit would like start to yell out. And my friend was lying on the table and her chest started to lift up off the table to the point where she was like, maybe a foot off the table, and she was just kind of yelling out, and it was all very weird. I didn't really understand what was happening, but then it was my turn to get on the table. So I laid down, and they're doing this stuff, just kind of waving their hands, and his wife is laughing. And then suddenly I start to get this pain in my toe, and it felt like this, I don't know, rushing feeling out of my foot. But it hurt really bad. Like the pain was getting so intense, and I told him to stop it, but he wasn't stopping. And I'm like yelling, I'm like, "Stop it. This is really hurting." And he's not. And I started to get really mad. So I just started to like kick him. And then I'm like, oh, darn, the people in the pews watching this are going to think like I'm possessed or something but I'm just, mad. That's how I was interpreting it, because this guy's hurting my foot and he's not stopping. So at some point that was over, and I was just like, oh my God, what the heck was that? I go back and sit down, and yeah, I was just like, whatever that was, like, I didn't appreciate him, and I was convinced he must have like taken a knife or something and, was going into my foot with it. Well, we came back the next day, for another round of this torture. And, again, I'm sitting, in the pews, just, watching, and a new group came in, people that hadn't been there before. So I thought that was interesting because the first person who laid down, they had not been there before, but they had the same reaction we all did. Like they start, yelling out in pain. And, so then at one point, that person goes back and another person comes up. And at one point he stops and he turns and he looks at me. The healer looks at me and he gestures for me to come up. And I was like, okay, why does he want me to come up? Because at that point he had another person on the table and he gestured for me to come and stand by their foot. And then he had me take my finger and put it on the person's toe. And then he held my arm. He didn't touch their foot at all. He just had me touch their toe and touch my arm. And then he started to like do this yelling out thing. And suddenly that person started screaming out in pain. And so then he explained to me later, he said, I never use any kind of instrument. It's that we're pulling the spirits out and they're coming out of the foot and all the pain that the body has been holding on to. He said it wasn't just spirits, it's pain that's in the body that comes out when you're doing an exorcism. And so, I thought, well, that was pretty interesting because the person, reported that they really did, feel that pain when I was just very gently touching them. So, now this was my very first trip there. When I got back, I went back to the healing clinic in Berkeley that I often participated in. And one of my friends was there and I was doing an aura healing for her. And an aura healing is basically where you just run your hand, you don't touch the body at all. You just run your hands in front of different parts of the body and visualize energy moving. Well, I was like somewhere around midsection with my friend. And then suddenly I, kind of around her hip area. And suddenly in my head, I started hearing the voice of that healer saying, "Out, you demons, get out." And it was like I was hearing his voice repeating that. So at that moment, I thought, was there some kind of effect from that on me as a healer? So I decided I was going to see, and I was going to just say, I wasn't going to say that out loud, but in my head with my friend, I pictured the energy coming out of her foot and just started to like go like this to her foot without saying anything. And I hadn't told her about my experience. And she starts screaming that this pain is coming out of her toe and that was excruciating and I should stop. So it's experiences like that have given me some extra confirmation that yes, something is happening here. And then of course the changes that happen in a person afterwards.
As I recall, Debra, David Oligani was the Philippine healer who had worked with Doug Vokes. And I wrote about this in the 1975 edition of my book, The Roots of Consciousness. I recall it was attacked by the amazing Randy of all people because he said, "You're encouraging people to go see these quacks in the Philippines instead of getting proper treatment." I understand that's a legitimate criticism, potentially. But from what I hear, you saying it's kind of a mixed bag in the Philippines.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely saw, cases of people being healed, and I saw lots of cases of people who didn't seem to, be healed or feel much of an effect. Again, anyone who is skeptical would take this topic of all and, have a field day with it. That being said, there has been a lot of very legitimate researchers that came with their film crews, that did very extensive interviews with people that were being healed. There's different researchers that did follow-up studies which is very hard to do, but after someone goes to one of the healers to then talk to their medical practitioners to, find out if there's been a change. There hasn't been a ton of studies like that for sure. There's, just been a couple ones in the literature. And it's been a very mixed bag. They've definitely tested the materials coming out, and a lot have been found to be chicken guts or other things. In fact, Manuel just recently told me, I checked back in with him, and again, it's a touchy subject because, people who, he's just not really supposed to talk about this, but he said that what the healers sometimes do when they go to other countries who are faking it is that they'll get blood from the American Red Cross. They'll actually get human blood. So some of the studies that have been done, have found that it was human blood, but, given that they could get the blood from the Red Cross, that doesn't really prove anything either. So there's just so many questions. And, really, as I talk about in the article, if you really would want to set this up as a legitimate study, you'd really have to take some of these healers, bring them into a lab, completely strip them of everything, have them do the manifestations, and then take that and have that get tested. And, I can't say that hasn't happened. I've been there where there were film crews and they were trying to do what they could to establish some tighter protocols in the situation. But, that's not the same thing as bringing someone into, a highly secure, lab and with witnesses. And then, and that's what I think needs to happen, if anyone is going to actually believe it. But then, of course, then, that may very much influence the, whether the healers could even do this in the first place. So, I'm at the point where personally, I would say probably about 95% of it isn't real. But I would say, maybe 5% is. And I would say it's probably really hard to tell the difference. So, this is not something that you want to even address with a skeptic.
I understand that in the literature of anthropology, the study of shamans all over the world, actually, there's a consistent pattern, which is that shamanistic healers engage in trickery. And that the reason for that, they claim when they confide to anthropologists, is that it puts the patient into a state of awe and amazement. And when the patient is in that state of mind, then they open up maybe to their own natural healing abilities or to the energy healing that may be coming from elsewhere. It doesn't seem to me that that's necessarily a bad thing. I know one might say, well, it's deceptive, but if at the end of the day a person gets healed, which is what they wanted and came for, maybe the deception is just what they needed.
Well, I know that's the excuse they give, but they could show other examples of, where people really have been legitimately healed. I just think the damage of being deceptive the damage isn't just personal to, that one person. Maybe that one person isn't damaged, but when it's discovered, it damages all of us, because it makes everyone else not believe. And, a lot of healers and intuitive practitioners, they feel the pressure. They feel pressure that even if they're very talented or successful, many feel the pressure pressure to keep up that performance and to keep up the results. And, I think it's essential that we are honest and realistic, about the shortcomings of this work, just like anything else. There's no doctor or surgeon who can guarantee that they heal everybody. They don't. How many people, under their care die? And that's why they have so much medical insurance. And so that they can't guarantee anything, and they're, following a materialistic framework. And so, it's the same thing with energy healers and with psychics. And, I was just a couple weeks ago at University of Virginia, the Department of Perceptual Studies, working with two of the researchers there, David and Marina, and they're working on a remote viewing study, like formulating it, where they're going to be testing what's happening in the brain of remote viewers when they're on target and also when they're off target. And so they were trying out some different things to see how we could best work together. And they had my brain hooked up to some EEG equipment and gave me some targets. And, so I did very well on a couple targets. I did moderately well. And one target I completely bombed. And unfortunately, that was the one where there was a reporter from the New York Times who came to observe. We were in this kind of Faraday cage, but it wasn't really soundproof. I had to ask her to tell the researchers to be a little quiet during that one session. But they actually asked if it would be okay if the reporter sat there with me, sat next to me, and I didn't mind. She was very nice. So I did a remote viewing session of an undisclosed target in an envelope with her sitting next to me. And when the researchers walked back in, they were like, well, how do you think you did? And I said, well, I either did really well or I really bombed this, but no in between, because everything was just too cohesive of a storyline. And they opened up the envelope and I looked at it, and sure enough, didn't get a single thing right. Bombed it 100%. And, I was disappointed, especially since God only knows what she's going to report now in the New York Times. She didn't see the other sessions. But, I was also kind of at peace with it, because what I said was, this is the reality of, this is how remote viewing is, right? Sometimes we have extraordinary hits, never cease to be amazed by those. Sometimes it's, hits and misses, and then sometimes you just totally bomb it. And that's the reality of the situation. So why do we have to pretend or try so hard to make it so it's not? Now, that doesn't mean we don't keep trying to hone our skills, try new methods, and hopefully the research that they're doing, if they can really see what the brain is showing when you're on or not, it will then, perhaps help us to get more correct than incorrect as we go along. But this is the current state of the field. And, I think I just got to the point where it's like, okay, that, it's okay, because that's how it is. And if you look at any study, any research, it's showing that range. And I would say the same thing with healing or any other human endeavor, so we don't need to, try to pretend it's that there isn't this range. We just need to keep working on understanding it and trying to improve upon it.
That would be true in general, especially for selfless healers such as your description, who aren't charging anything, who are devoting themselves to other people. But you do report that some of the Filipino healers have become quite wealthy.
Oh, yes, they have become very wealthy. And I'll qualify this with saying, I do not have any problem with people charging for their services. I charge for my intuitive services, and it's a lot less than doctors have charged, even though I've gotten, an equivalent amount of training in, different areas. But, so we charge for our time, for our training, for our experiences. I don't have a problem with that. Although I do respect someone, like I said, Manuel, who was willing to move in with a guy, and, maybe the guy gave him some fruit and vegetables for free. But, that was very admirable. But some of the healers have gotten very wealthy. And in fact, June Labo, who was one of the healers, I saw very impressive things. And I mean, there was like an entire, like 100 people standing there. And now I missed this, but my friends saw it. This was after he was done healing someone, but they like walked out of the healing room and there were all these people in the hallway, and he, everyone, all my friends, everyone saw this. He supposedly reached into the guy's eye and basically like took the eyeball out, and it was like hanging out of the eye. And then, cause he was like, oh, I still need to do this. And so he chased him down in the hallway, pulled his eyeball out in the hallway, and he's like doing something behind the eyeball and then put it back. And everyone was like, oh my God, we just saw this, and like multiple witnesses. So there were lots of things like that. And his place was actually, I was in his chapel and then went outside, and that was where I heard a voice who told me that everything in my life was going to change and I was going to have to leave my job and all this other stuff. I had this very powerful experience that like really, impacts me till this day at his place. So again, there were a lot of things happening, to make me feel and others that, this is a legitimate healer. And I'm not saying that he's not. I don't have evidence, to say that he was faking or anything like that. A lot of people have sworn he saved their lives, including one of his wives, that he ended up marrying a woman from Russia. But he did end up going to Russia, and the Russian police put him in jail for several months. And again, did they put him in jail because, they found he was faking, or they just assumed he had to be because it can't be real? It seemed very strange. And then I would go after he was done with his healing. He would be sitting in his office, smiling and counting his cash. And he had a lot of cash all over his table. And he had this huge healing center. And at one point he had like these animals, like elephants and tigers and things like that. Actually, I'm not sure about the elephants, but he had tigers in cages. He had these giant ceramic elephants, but not real, but he had like real animals like lions and tigers. And he also owned like several brothels that were right next door. So again, it's like, if I was going to give this a title, I'd say with the Philippines, it was like the light and darkness of the, Philippine healers, or what is that movie, like Good and Evil, or Light and Darkness in the Garden of, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, but this theme of light and dark, and it's very confusing, what's happening here. And of course, someone might just look at it like, oh, a guy has, brothels, and he's obviously very fixated on money and, all of this evidence. And they'd be like, why would you believe this for a second? Well, he has literally healed thousands and thousands of people. And in fact, I'll just share this. When I was leaving the Philippines, I'd taken all these pictures. So I have, like 100 pictures of the bloody operation of half naked people. Cause a lot of times, like they'll have you take off most of your clothes. So I would have pictures of like half naked people, including myself, blood all over the body. And I get to the airport, and now keep in mind, I was 28 years old, a little bit naive. I didn't even think about, what is customs going to say when they open up my suitcase and look at these pictures. So that was exactly what happened on one trip. And, fortunately, I probably avoided getting arrested for murder, an accomplice to murder or something, because the customs agents knew who June Labo was. Like he had healed their great aunt or something. And so when I explained it and explained who I had just worked with and who these pictures were, Instead of arresting me, they got very excited and wanted to talk all about it and tell me the stories of how he had healed, their relatives. So, that's why to anyone else it might sound ridiculous, but there are so many people, and again, a lot of researchers who, left saying, I'm quite convinced this is real.
Let's talk a bit about the modality of the healing. I know many healers, particularly in Brazil, are spiritualists, and they come out of the Kardec Spiritism tradition, and they believe that there are spirit doctors on the other side who do the healing. But if a healer is an energy healer, they may say, no, I channel love, I channel positive energy, and the healing occurs that way. Or maybe some healers say, I go into trance and I don't even know what I do because I'm not conscious when it takes place.
Yes. Well, the healers in the Philippines, almost all, if not all, say that they are channeling the Holy Spirit. That is who they are channeling. And some of them will go into a state where it does seem like they are not aware of what's happening. They change their demeanor, their eyes even look different. I would say that's true with June Labo. Some of the healers, in fact, I became friends with the niece of one healer, and this one healer, Arsinia, she was supposed to be the granddaughter of one of the very first psychic surgeons in Pangasinan, Philippines. It was this little village out in the tobacco fields, and I spent some time there. And there was an older healer there. He was probably about 90 years old or so. And this would all take place in their little chapel. And they called their chapel the Espiritista Church. So they were, at the time, I didn't realize that this did come out of Kardec's teachings and was related to the physical mediums in Europe. But I noticed some parallels, but I didn't know that there actually was until studying that later. But they would, every week, on Saturdays, in their little village, they would do all these different practices for and lessons for the children and young people, teenagers, where you would learn how to speak in tongues. Basically, you would learn how to channel. You'd learn, they called it magnetic healing, how to do that. And this very old healer, when he would do any kind of healing, he would go into a trance, and supposedly he would leave his body and another spirit would come in. And they didn't say who was coming in beyond the Holy Spirit. But what would happen is at some point that entity would leave. And when that entity left, he would topple over. His body was stiff as a board. And when the spirits left, he would completely fall over because he was not conscious. And so they always had to have a couple people right behind him there to catch him. And I saw a couple of times they weren't fast enough, and the guy ended up flat on his back on the floor, and that would start to wake him up. So, that was the most extreme case of a healer not being conscious during a healing. But they would go into what seemed like an altered state. And a lot of them had stories of when they were very young. And this was true with June Labo when he was just 9 or 10 years old. Supposedly, somebody had gotten hurt, and he ran over to the body, to the person who was hurt, and there was some kind of effect that he had on them. He went into kind of an altered state, and then this person was healed. And so a lot of them had stories like that where, they just went to help someone as a child and then had a a positive effect. I will say that a lot of them do also seem to use their clairvoyance. And this is true of the ones that I witnessed in the Philippines. And then also what I read about the Brazilian healers. In the Philippines, what they do is they'll take a white sheet and hold it over the body, but they're doing this very, very quickly. But they hold it over the body, and then supposedly they see what needs to be worked on, and then they just go to work on it. And you know, in my readings of Brazil, now you said when we talked earlier before the interview, you said that you spent some time there. So I haven't been there, but just did a lot of reading on it. And the psychic surgeons over there, rather than just laying their hands on people, they would use tools like knives. And there was one healer called the rusty knife.
Arrigo, the surgeon with the rusty knife. Yeah. Studied by Andrea Puharich, and a book by John Fuller was written about him.
Yeah, and I think you've done some interviews on Puharich recently. Is that right?
That is correct. And one of these days, the documentary which is being made about the life of Puharich will be released, but I'm under the impression that's been delayed even further. Puharich was a pioneer in looking at this sort of thing. When I was in Brazil, near Rio de Janeiro, I visited a little community called Frei Luís. I believe it's still in existence, although I'm under the impression things have changed since I was there back in the 1980s. But what they showed me, I didn't witness it per se, they showed me photographs. They say in their healing sessions, they conduct a seance. In the seance, the spirit doctors materialize, and the spirit doctors in material form perform the psychic surgeries.
Yeah, that's really wild. And that does go along with some of the physical mediums who also seem to heal in that same way. So, you know, that does go back to that they do come from a similar lineage where Kardec's teachings did really spread well beyond Europe to Brazil and the Philippines and some limited places in the Caribbean. But yeah, you know, there's came across stories of healers wanting to prove that when they're doing the healing, because they're in this whole different realm, you know, it's basically, they say like it's almost like being in another dimension where disease can't happen or infection can't happen, you know, because of course that's, you know, we hear someone's using like an unsterile knife or even a rusty one and with no anesthetic. That's the other thing, is that in Brazil, they're almost never using anesthetic, and yet the patients are not screaming out in pain. They're, you know, barely voicing that there's any discomfort at all, like during and afterwards. And there has been quite a few researchers who then, you know, did follow up to see, like, was there infection afterwards? And, you know, they said there wasn't. But again, these studies are very limited. You know, maybe we're not hearing of all we don't ever get the feedback that some people actually died. But supposedly the studies haven't found that. But yeah, it's like one healer was known to spit into an open wound in order to show that there wouldn't be infection. And that just is disgusting. And also, you know, really impolite.
Maybe that's a good point to end on, Debra, that there remains a paradox in all of this, that it would be rather arrogant for anybody to say they have a final answer about it all. And I'm kind of inclined to think that this kind of phenomenon, which is probably true not only of psychic surgery, but of many, many of the dramatic manifestations, macropsychokinesis, the whole UFO realm is another example. These things seem to defy logic. So people who want a quick answer will say, well, it's all fake. Or people will say, no, it's real. I question whether, if you and I were here 1,000 years from now, after people research right and left these things, we may never get a final answer. It may be something that just defies human logic altogether.
Yeah, well, that's such a good point. And, we seem to pair together ethics with these extraordinary abilities. And why even make that assumption that the two should go together? That's a huge assumption we're operating out of. But we've seen that over and over again, that people who do display different extraordinary gifts, just oftentimes as people, they have flaws. Like you talked about so much the PK man and Ted Owens, where it really seems plausible that he was impacting the weather and, doing all these incredible feats, but he was a flawed human. And the fact is that we're all flawed, right? I mean, even, I care so much about people and want nothing more than to heal them. And I'm usually nice, but put me on the phone with talking to AT&T or the cable company who's put me on hold 3 times. In those moments, you might think I'm channeling the devil or something. Very, very nice. So yeah, we all have these different aspects to ourselves, but maybe we really need to trace back these original assumptions, and then we'll learn something new about how all of this really operates within ourselves.
Well, Debra, it's been a pleasure to be with you once again. Of course, the New Thinking Aloud audience knows you both as a guest and as a guest host on the program. And so I'm sure we'll have many, many more interactions, but I'm delighted to discover a side of your history and background that I knew nothing about until recently. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your interest and, of course, ever openness to these topics.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of issue 6 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.